Have you ever felt like you didn't have enough? And so the question is, what do you do when you feel like you don't have enough? What do you do when the weight of the world's... Oh, it was there. What do you do when the weight of the world is overwhelming? You go on the news or you get news feeds. We were talking even before the service. There's fights that break out at graduation celebrations. There's the war that continues in Iran. There's the latest virus that is discovered, and it's like, is it going to come here? Am I going to get sick? And then, of course, the upcoming elections. What's going to happen? There's divisions in our world. There's chaos in our country. And that doesn't even take into account the things that are personal in nature, the things that personally you're dealing with and I'm dealing with. Things like maybe there's something that's related to your health and you've got an issue and the doctors can't figure it out and you're like, God, what are you going to do? Are you going to be able to heal me? Maybe there's a financial issue and you're just thinking, like, how am I going to make it through the end of the month? Or maybe there's even a battle with anxiety that's so heavy that at times it's so crippling that you have trouble even catching your breath. Or maybe there's kids, there's adult kids or adult grandkids, and you're praying for them to come to Jesus. And you're begging God to bring them back before they do something that it's too difficult to recover from. So what do you do when life gives you more than you can handle? What do you do when you give everything you've got, and yet that's not enough? And it's not easy living in these days today. And I'm not here this morning, I'm not going to come up with 3 easy steps to make your life so easy, because that's not where we're at in the world. I want to acknowledge that we live in a broken, painful, divided, and sin-filled world that is very, very complicated. But even though that's the bad news, the good news is that God is in control. God reigns supreme. He rules over the nations. And that same God who's all-powerful and all-knowing cares about you. Cares about each and every one of us. And that's the kind of God we serve and we love and we live for. And so you might be sitting here, you may have come in and said, how am I going to make it? How am I going to make it through and get through this? And so the big idea for this morning is when I don't have enough, not enough is where God starts. Now, I always have to make the preface. This is going to come up and I'm going to ask you to echo, but I'm eventually going to get to the end of the sermon. You might go, really, Pastor Ray? You're going to end a sermon? Yes, I'm going to end the sermon. And it's going to be the final slide. And I'm not going to want you to echo that. That's just going to be me. So when you're looking at your watch and you're like, okay, where am I going to go to lunch? And that slide comes up, that's just me. That's my part, not yours. All right, so I'm going to say it, then you echo it back. When I don't have enough, not enough is where God starts. When I don't have enough, enough is where... And I'm reminded of the thing that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians, very familiar verse where Paul said, my grace is sufficient for you. He's quoting from God, that what God said to him when he was saying, God, would you remove this thorn of the flesh from me? And God says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. Therefore, and this is Paul saying, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest in me. So if you are wondering, how am I going to get through? If I don't have enough, if I can't make it through, remember that his grace is sufficient. So we're in week 3 of Elisha, a life driven by faith, and we've been going through and talking about Elisha from the time that Elijah called him to a prophet, and then last week we looked at what happened when he stepped into that prophet role, and then this one is where we're going to get into 2 Kings chapter 4. And he comes across this widow, And this widow just lost her husband, and now she's about to lose her sons. And so 2 Kings 4, verse 1 picks up our story. It says, the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord, but now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves. So we have this widow, and she's mourning the loss of her husband, and she's trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do next? Her husband was a part of the company of the prophets. These are young men who studied under Elisha. They were kind of like in training, kind of like seminarians, learning how to do what a prophet does, discerning the will of the Lord and the word of the Lord. And her husband passes away. And she says, the one who was following you, the one who gave it all up to learn and worship your God is now gone. And now his debt has fallen to my family, and we can't pay it. And so the creditor is going to come and take my sons away. And you might think, well, first of all, it's a good thing it doesn't happen today. But back then, when there was a debt for the family, if the husband passed away, that debt fell onto the wife and the rest of the family. And if they could not pay that debt, the creditor had the right to go and take the children and make them temporary slaves to pay off the debt. And oftentimes, that could be 4 to 6 years, depending on how large the debt was. And so you can imagine this mom, this widow, is devastated. She's in grief. She's mourning the loss of her husband. And now she has life in front of her as a widow. She knows she's not going to be able to probably get a job. She knows that her sons are liable to be taken away from her, and she will be all alone. And so in her mind, she is without hope. She doesn't know how she's going to make it through. And so Elisha, after hearing this from her, asks a very simple question. How can I help you? How can I help you? Or if we maybe were to come across someone like that, we might even say it this way. We might say, how can I serve you? How can I help you? And so her response says this. She says, tell me, what do you have in your house? So Elisha's saying, well, what do you have? And she's like, well, I don't have anything. And then it's almost like she goes, oh, I do have a small jar of olive oil. And so her answer, it's almost like, oh, I don't have anything. I don't have anything in my house that I could sell to help pay off this debt. And then she's like, well, I do have a little bit of olive oil. And the hard thing is that when she is thinking about this, she's like, oh, I've got nothing. She's majoring on what she doesn't have. And oftentimes I think that happens with us because when you and I are hurting, it's really easy to see what I don't have. It's real easy to look and say, you know what, I don't have this. And she's looking at her life now and she's like, you know what, I don't have a husband. I don't have any savings. I don't have a job. I might not have even my sons. And in reality, I don't even have hope. And yet oftentimes that's where we go. We go down that road of comparison and go, you know what? This is what I don't have. I don't have this or I don't have that. I don't have a spouse. I don't have anything in my savings or retirement. I don't have kids that come and check on me. I don't have a church that has whatever or does whatever. I don't have a job that allows this or gives me that. Or maybe just, I don't have, and you can fill in the blank. Something that you wished you had, but you don't. And if we live there, if we live on the road of comparison, all these things are going to swirl. And they're going to cause us to spiral down an emotional staircase that ultimately leads to fear because we don't have enough. And yet, what did Paul write to Timothy? He said, we do not have a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and a sound mind. And right now, the enemy is spreading a whole bunch of lies, causing a whole lot of fear. And maybe you're buying into that fear. Maybe you don't have something and you're like, oh, if I don't have that, how am I going to make it? Maybe you are trying to get a new job and you don't get it. And you're like, oh, I just can't, I'm not good enough. Or maybe you're praying to God and you're worshiping Him and He's not responding. And so you stop and you're like, God, are you even there? Do you hear me? Have you forgotten me? And so we're letting fear control our lives. We're letting the fear of what we don't have drown out the faith of what God has already given us. Because that's where we're thinking. And fear doesn't just exaggerate. Fear also lies. And that's where we can go. And that's where our widow is trending. She's trending towards, how am I going to make it? And so she's focusing on what she's lost instead of what she has. And so Elisha says, what do you have? And she's like, well, I guess I have some olive oil. And so what can a little olive oil do? And this is probably a flask, probably something small that you would use for everyday uses, and then there would be a bigger storage jar of olive oil in the back. I was thinking about this, and it's kind of similar, at least in our house. Like we have salt and pepper shakers, but then we have a canister of salt that we can replenish the salt shaker. I mean, we also have a ton of other salts, but that's just a whole other thing. Salt is salt, but evidently pink salt is special. What can you do with oil? You can cook with oil. You can also use that oil to burn some lamps at night. You can mix the oil with some herbs, and back then that's how they would make some medicine. You could even, as you follow along in the Old Testament, anoint someone or something with oil to set it apart and to pray for a miracle from God. But it was something very, very small, something very insignificant and ordinary. Even in the widow's eyes, it was insufficient. She even forgot about it. And yet, when she commits that to God, when she gives it over to God, the spectacular can happen. And so maybe you're sitting here this morning and you're thinking about what you don't have, and God's saying, well, think about what you have. And if you turn it over, I might be able to do the spectacular. Maybe you think you don't have enough time. And so you're working 2 jobs and you're trying to be with your family and you're trying to do all these different things, and you're like, man, if I just had more time. Maybe you look at yourself and you're like, I don't have the confidence I need to manage life, to believe in yourself, to fix that relationship. Maybe you don't have the faith that you think you need to call on God. Because again, as we've talked about through this series, we've talked about this idea that risk must be paired with trust. And so maybe you're too conservative. Maybe you're thinking, I can't step out and risk that. And yet we need to trust God, because when we put our faith into action, it becomes active faith. Because faith without action is not active faith. Or maybe you're like the widow and you're at the end of your rope and you're like, I have no hope. I just don't have any hope. I don't have hope that God hears my prayers. I don't have hope that He is going to provide. I don't have hope that He's going to change that loved one. I don't have hope that He can bring life to our church. Maybe you're moving away and you're moving towards that state of hopelessness. And so wherever you are, You might think that you don't have enough, but God's going to bring in, and that's where he starts, because when I don't have enough, not enough is where God starts. When I don't have enough. All right, we're hanging in there. Because when you get to the end of yourself, you realize that's when you experience the goodness, the presence, and the strength of our God. So now if you're there, if you're ready to say, that's where I'm at, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to live practically? Well, eventually the widow came to the idea that I need to offer my little up to God. I have to say, Elisha, I have just this little bit of oil. You need to risk that little and trust God to step in and say, God, I trust you with this. When you think about Scripture and you think about the examples of this, I was reminded of David. When David went to the battlefield, he was a shepherd. He was given the job of taking food to his brothers by his dad. And he shows up on the battlefield and he hears that they're scared. He sees Goliath. And he goes down and he says, I will fight Goliath because he is blaspheming the name of God. And so he gets down into the valley and Goliath looks at him and he says, he looked over and saw that he was little, more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. Probably Goliath was thinking, one day I looked like that, but now I'm old and I'm a warrior. And then he says this, he said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And then David responded, he said, you come against me with sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down, and I will cut off your head. And we know the rest of the story. That happened. Another story I was reminded of this week was Jesus and his disciples. Remember, Jesus is going around, he's teaching, he's healing, and it's getting late, and he was trying to get his disciples away from the crowd so he could pour into them and give them some rest. And the crowds kept following them, and so at the end of a very, very busy day, his disciples look at him and say this to Jesus. By this time it was late into the day. His disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. There's all these people following them, 5,000 men, not including women and children, and they're like, send them away, help them, make them find food. And then Jesus says, no, not so fast. You give them something to eat. Jesus challenges them to fix the problem, to solve the problem. And they come up with all these excuses. And I think it was Andrew, probably Andrew the accountant, who's like, you know what? We don't have enough money to even buy something where we could give them a little morsel, a little scrap of something to eat. And then he's like, pushes them a little further. He goes, well, how much food can you find? And they answered, well, we found 5 loaves and 2 fish. And we know the rest of the story. Disciples, they came to realize that not enough, maybe not enough in their eyes, but with Jesus stepping in, he met that need. And so how much faith do we need for God to step in? How much do we need to trust him and risk what we have and give it over to him? In Matthew, he put it this way. Jesus was saying, when you have little faith, truly I tell you, if faith is small as a mustard seed, not as big as a mountain, not as great as an ocean, but as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. God can do a lot with a little, because when I don't have enough, not enough is where God starts. When I don't have enough. Some of you thought the message was done then. I'm still going. Come on. Because we got the story. We got to find out what happens. Verse 3, Elisha said, go around, ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. And this is where it gets personal. Everyone around tuck their toes in because they're going to get stepped on. It's one thing to see that you have a need. It's one thing to say, God, move into my life and help meet that need. God, I trust you to come in. But what did Elisha tell her to do? Go and ask your neighbors for help. It's one thing to see our need. It's one thing to ask God to move in our need. But it's a whole big jump to ask God and go to others and admit our need to others. It's one thing behind closed doors to say, God, I need you, and admit your need there. It's another thing to go to a neighbor, to a friend, and say, I need help. And most of us, whether it's me or you, we don't mind giving help. We wouldn't mind being the neighbors and saying, hey, oh, you need some jars? Yes, I can find you jars. But being the widow and admitting your need, I don't know if I could do that. Because here's the thing, pride doesn't borrow jars. Pride doesn't borrow jars. Pride goes, you know what? Elisha, thanks for that. I'm going to look in my house. I'm going to go out to the recycling bin and see what I got. I'm not going to go door to door. I'm not going to tell my neighbors that I need help. And yet, some of us right now are sitting here, and we know we don't have enough, but we're too proud to ask for help. We're too proud to activate our faith and make it lively and go out and say, I need help. Because that's what God is waiting for you to do. If she would have just said, Elisha, thanks for that. I've only got one jar in my house. If she didn't do what she was asked to do, God could not have done the spectacular. So Elisha says, go out and ask for jars, and that's what she does. And in verse 4, she gets all these jars, and they line them up. And Elisha says, go inside and shut the door behind you, and your sons pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. And so she did that. She left him, shut the door behind her, and her sons, they brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. And so they go out and they knock on the doors. Hey, do you have some spare jars? And they, sure, and they get all these jars and they line them all up. They were probably storage jars, the ones that they kept in the back that were empty. And so she takes her flask of a little bit of oil and she starts pouring, and then the sons bring another one and they start pouring. Just imagine being in that room, being one of the sons, and realizing the flask is like, this size, and she's pouring this big jar, and they bring another jar and pour their jar, and they just keep going and going and going. And I'm sure the sons were like, where's all this oil coming from? And they keep doing it, and they keep doing it, and they keep doing it. And then finally, verse 6, when all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one. But he replied, there is not a jar left. And then the oil stopped flowing. And so she went and she found Elisha, and she said, Elisha said, go and sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest. And so the widow and her sons witnessed this fact. With God, not enough is more than enough. As long as the jars were there, the oil kept coming in. Could be any size, any shape. Imagine if someone came knocking on your door, hey, do you have some jars I could borrow? And you'd be like, yeah, hold on, here's a pickle jar, here's a gallon jug, here's a peanut butter jar. Some of you maybe, hey, here's this little salsa jar. You can get that one too. And what was the only requirement for the jars? The jars had to be empty. The jar had to be empty because when we figure out what we need to empty in our lives, God can fill it. And so the question that we end with today is that. What do you need to empty in your life so that God can fill it? Maybe it's the jar of pride. And you're like, God, I know that I need you and I need the help of others. And so you're going to empty that jar of pride and self-reliance. You're going to admit your need. You're going to tell people, you know what, I do need help. And people will come alongside and help. And that's the first step on the road to realizing your place in the world. To realize, you know what, I need to live with a little more humility and a little more need that God can provide. Maybe you have a jar filled with fear, and you've looked around and you're not sure what's going to happen, and you're believing the lies that fear is telling you. And you just need to memorize, and you need to remember that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. And when we live in that world, we can live an active faith. Maybe you have a desire, a jar full of control, and you're like, God, I got to control everything around me. And he's saying, no, you can only control nothing. So give it all to me. Empty that jar. Realize that I am in control. Trust me. Maybe you have a jar full of shame from things you've done in the past, and you need to confess that and say, God, forgive me and take away that shame. Maybe you have a need to put on a facade and feel strong when inside you're weak and need help. Or maybe you have a jar full of anger, and you got to empty that jar because there's unmet expectations and people aren't doing what you said, and so you're getting all angry. And so we empty those jars, and then we ask God, you know what? Fill our minds with your word. Renew our minds and conform us to the image of your Son. Help us be transformed by that renewal of our minds. And in the same passage, it says in Romans 13 or 12, when you draw near to God, he will draw near to you. And so when you empty your life of what doesn't matter, God's going to fill it with what does matter. Because not enough is where he starts, and with God, not enough is more than enough. And so when you think about the widow, she was overwhelmed. She lost her husband. She was about to lose her sons. And she goes to this prophet and she says, will you help me? And maybe that's where you're at this morning, and you have to take that step. You have to admit you need help. And maybe it's help in one of those areas, or maybe it's the idea of the fact that you are not a believer. You've not made that decision in your life to trust, to risk your future, your eternity, to trust in what Jesus did. And to say, you know what? I can't do it myself. I have to trust in what Jesus did. Because when I don't have enough, that's where God starts. Father, we just come before you now, and as we think about our lives, we realize that we fall short. And if we all were honest, we could say there is an area or two or even many where we're not enough. We don't have enough. We don't feel that we have enough. And we're holding out and being prideful and selfish. And so, Father, help us to realize that first step is to realize that we are not enough. We don't have enough. And when we do that, that's when you can step in. That's where you start to work in our lives. That's where you start to provide. That's where you start to make a difference. And as we looked at our widow this morning, that's where spectacular happens. And so, Father, help us. Search us and reveal to us those areas, those jars that need to be emptied so that you can fill them with you and your love, your forgiveness, your grace, your mercy. Help us to bring honor and glory to you by the way that we admit that we need you. And it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.